A good Vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you. It's great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Paul in the great Northwest. Now what? There we go. Bill in mid-Missouri. Where'd it go? Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida. Mark says hello. Chaim in Florida. Frank says hello. Mark is in Portland, Oregon. Welcome, everybody. With God's help, we will open and complete Mishna number 4 here in chapter 2 of Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. So we've talked about many times that one of the primary categories of damage that were listed right at the beginning of our tractate, right? So there was the ox, fire, pit, and mave, which is probably means human, that human force. But with regard to the ox, there's the primary, they're not subcategories, they're deemed primary categories, but relating to the ox of goring, eating, and trampling. And goring is different than eating and trampling because even if it happens in the public domain, the owner is liable. But there's the two different cases, the tam, or the innocuous ox, and the muad, or the forewarned ox, meaning that the owner was forewarned because this ox was a habitual gorer. Right, so the muad is the habitual gorer, the ox that has gored before several times, and at that point, if it gores again, instead of the owner having to pay for half the damages, now the owner is liable for all the damages. And if the value of the animal itself is not enough to pay for the damages, the victim, the injured party, can go after the land, the real property of the ox's owner. And it has to be the superior quality land, right? The best of his land. Now, what was I just going to say about the ox? Oh, and like all these categories, pit, fire, ox, it's not only an ox, it's not only a hole in the ground, it's not only a fire, but by analogy, by extension, we're going to apply these principles to other kinds of damages. So now we really have to understand, okay, what is the difference between the tam and the muad? And that's what this Mishna number 4 is all about. Which type of ox is deemed tam, innocuous, and which is deemed forewarned, right, the muad. So an ox is deemed forewarned in any case where witnesses testified about it that it gored on 3 different days, and it reverts back to its previous innocuous status from when it reverses its behavior and refrains from goring on 3 consecutive days. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says it is deemed forewarned in any case where witnesses testified that it gored 3 times, regardless of the number of days on which this behavior occurred. And it reverts back to its previous innocuous status in any case where children pet it and play with it, and it does not gore them. I mean, my goodness, if the law is according to Rabbi Meir, that the only way for the ox to regain its innocuous status is to have children play with it and not be gored, I would imagine that not too many habitual gorers reattain that status, at least not purposely. But let us see. That's Mishnah number 4. Here comes the Gemara. Now, the Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that an ox is deemed forewarned, muad, only if it gored on 3 separate days? So Abaye said, well, it states in the verse, Exodus 21:36. This is the law of the habitual gorer. Or if it is known that the ox was a goring ox from yesterday and the day before yesterday, and its owner has not secured it. So this leads to the following inference. Yesterday, this indicates 1 day. From yesterday, like to today, that indicates 2 days. And the day before yesterday indicates 3 days. And its owner has not secured it. Here we arrive at a fourth incident of goring for which the owner pays the full amount of damages. So the way that Abaye understands what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that the ox gored on 3 separate occasions, and witnesses testified that that happened. So then the fourth time that the ox gores another animal or a person, only then is it considered a muad, and that's when the owner has to pay full damages, right? So it took 3 instances of the innocuous ox goring for it to be relabeled as a muad, as a gorer, a goring ox. Now, Rava said, yesterday and from yesterday are not to be expounded separately. Rather, the inference from this phrase is that from yesterday indicates 1 day, the day before yesterday indicates 2 days, and its owner has not secured it indicates now, the third incident, as it is liable as a forewarned animal for the third goring. That's why you've heard me several times refer to this as, in the 23 days prior to today, when this has come up. Now I always say, well, is it 2 times or 3 times? And it's this disagreement between Rav and Abaye, right? So is it that it gored 3 times, and then the 4th time the owner is held liable as the owner of a habitual gorer? Or is it that it gored twice, and on the 3rd instance the owner is held liable as for owning a habitual gorer, per the opinion of Rava? Let's see. And it's interesting that we don't really get, here's the halacha. Which is deemed forewarned? An animal is deemed forewarned if witnesses testify that it gored on 3 different days. If the animal gored on 1 day, even if they issued warnings against it several times that day, it is not deemed forewarned, following the ruling of the Gemara in 24a in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So that's the next question we're going to talk about is, did these 3 gorings, per Rabbi Yehuda, happen on the same day or on 3 different days? In other words, was it just 3 gorings, or did it have to happen on 3 separate days, or even 3 consecutive days? Rabbi Meir is going to talk about that. But when do we become a gorer? I mean, if we're following Rabbi Yehuda in terms of the consecutive days, or separate days, let's say, then perhaps we're following Rabbi Yehuda on the fact that it's 3 times there was a goring, and then it's only on the 4th time that the ox is considered a muad. But we haven't really agreed on that. And in fact, Rashi and Rav Hagayon explain that Abaye and Rava disagree as to whether the owner of the ox will be liable to pay the full cost of the damage for the 4th incident of goring, or if he must do it starting from the 3rd incident. And this seems to be the simplest way to understand the passage. Tosafos and a number of other early commentaries are of the opinion that all agree that he must pay the full cost of the damage, only beginning with the 4th incident, and the dispute between Abaye and Rava is not about the law itself, but only about how to derive this law from the verse. So you can see there's still a little bit of ambiguity there, but let's continue. So, the Gemara asks, and what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who does not determine the forewarned status of an ox by the number of days on which the animal gored, but simply by the number of times that it gored, right? Not 3 days, but 3 times. As it is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Meir said, and now we're on page 24a, when the ox performs its gorings at intervals, its owner is liable. If it performs its gorings successively, is it not all the more so that the owner is liable? And they said to Rabbi, in other words, if it gored 3 times in 1 day, that sounds like a really dangerous ox, and the owner should have restrained it. what difference does it make if it gored on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and only then we're going to give it this label of the goring ox? If it did it all 3 times in one day, the counter argument might be, well, that particular day was a weird thing. It got attacked by a bunch of wasps and it went crazy and it gored 3 different people. But every other day of its life, it wasn't like that. So you can see there's 2 arguments there. So they said to Rabbi Meir, the law with regard to a woman who experiences a discharge of uterine blood after her menstrual period, she's known as a zava, will prove that your kal v'chomer inference is invalid, right? So Rabbi Meir is saying, if we're going to call it a muad after it gores on 3 consecutive days, how much more so should we call it a muad if it gored 3 times in one day? And the Gemara is going to say, no, Rabbi Meir, you're wrong. And the law of the zava will show this. So a zava is a woman who bleeds outside of her normal time of the month, the expected time when it would have been her period. So she has a discharge on some other day. So then the question is she just having spotting on one day? If it just happens once, then exactly she can just wait until nightfall, immerse in the mikveh, and she's clean again. She and her husband are permitted to each other. If it happens on 2 consecutive days, she can still wait for nightfall and immerse in the mikveh. If it happens on 3 consecutive days, then she becomes a zava, and she's going to have to go through a different and more elaborate purification process before she and her husband are permitted to each other again. Okay, so let's see how we're going to learn out from that body of law to the law of the muad or the tom ox. So the law of the zava will prove that your kal v'chomer inference is invalid, Rabbi Meir. Because if her sightings occur at intervals, i.e. if she sees a flow of uterine blood on 3 consecutive days, so she becomes tameh, ritually impure, while if her sightings were consecutive, for example, if all 3 occurred on the same day, she remains tahor, pure. It has to happen on 3 days or that law doesn't kick in. So Rabbi Meir said to them, the case of the zava does not disprove my opinion, because the verse states in reference to the parallel law of a man who experiences a gonorrhea-like discharge, known as a zav, and this shall be his ritual impurity when he has a discharge. And the word this emphasizes that in this matter, the law requires following the instructions of the verse precisely as they were recorded. And in this case, the verse associates the impurity, the tuma of the zav, the man, with the number of sightings or of discharges that man observed. It doesn't matter how many days it happened on. For a man to become, for the law of the zav to apply to him, he has to have 3 discharges, and they can all happen on the same day. Whereas with a woman to become a zava, it has to happen on 3 consecutive days, and it doesn't kick in if it happened all in one day. So what Rabbi Meir is saying is, well, you're right that the law of the zava would seem to, undermine my argument about the muad ox, but the law of the zav bolsters my argument about the law of the muad. So you can't. Why should I apply the law of the zava when I can apply the law of the zav? So the Gemara asks about the interpretation. From where is it determined that this additional phrase "and this" serves to exclude a zava from having her status determined by individual sightings of blood, associating it instead with the number of days on which she experienced bleeding? Say instead that it serves to exclude the zav from having his status determined by sightings on separate days, indicating that he will be rendered a zav only if he experienced 3 discharges on a single day and not on separate days. And the Gemara answers, the verse states elsewhere, and one who has a discharge, whether it be a man or a woman, Leviticus 15:33. And the verse juxtaposes the ritual impurity, the tuma, of a male to that of a female, to teach that just as the female's ritual impurity is caused by sightings on multiple days, so too the ritual impurity of a male can be caused by sightings on multiple days. So the Gemara asks, the derivation from the verse could just as easily lead to the opposite conclusion. But let him compare the female to the male. And just as the male becomes ritually impure based on the number of sightings, even if they all occur on the same day, perhaps so too should a female become ritually impure based on the number of sightings, even on the same day. And the Gemara answers, but the merciful one excluded this possibility by making use of the term and this, right? Vezois. So the Gemara asks, and what did you see to make you exclude associating the ritual impurity of a woman with the number of sightings rather than excluding associating the ritual impurity of men with the number of days? And the Gemara answers, it stands to reason that this is so, as the context of the verse deals with sightings, and therefore an additional phrase serves to exclude sightings. But can you say that in a context where it deals with sightings, it excludes days? Sightings meaning instances, times that this happens, versus days on which it happens. The exclusionary term "and this" appears in the section discussing the law of the zav, the male, in the context of which it mentions sightings and not days. And therefore, when it excludes something from these laws and limits them to specific cases, it will exclude it from being associated with sightings. So the Gemara returns to the subject of classifying an ox as a tam or a muad. The sages taught in a baraisa which type of ox is deemed forewarned, the muad. Any animal about which witnesses testified that it gored on 3 days is forewarned, and it reverts to its former innocuous status if children pet it, and nevertheless it does not gore. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Shimon says, a forewarned ox is any ox about which witnesses testified that it gored 3 times. And the sages spoke about 3 days only with regard to reversals, meaning that in order for an ox to revert to innocuous status, the ox must refrain from goring on 3 separate days. Each of these additional views on this subject combine aspects of both the opinions mentioned in the Mishna, those of Rabbi Yehuda and those of Rabbi Meir. Right? So Rabbi Yehuda said the ox becomes a muad, a habitual gorer, if it gores on 3 separate occasions, 3 separate days, right? And witnesses testify about that to a court. And Rabbi Meir said 3 times, right? 3 times, and it could all happen on the same day. And with respect to how the ox can regain, how a muad can regain its status as a tam, Rabbi Yehuda said if it doesn't gore on 3 separate occasions when it could have on separate days, and Rabbi Meir says it regains its status if it doesn't gore when children pet it. Okay, and then Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon combine aspects of those rulings of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir in their own rulings. Now, Rav Nachman says that Rav Ada bar Ahava says, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda concerning the criteria for deeming an animal forewarned, goring on 3 separate days, as Rabbi Yosei concedes to his opinion on this issue, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir concerning the criteria for reverting the status of an animal to be innocuous, as Rabbi Yosei concedes to his opinion on that issue. Right? So Rav Nachman and Rav Ada bar Ahava are saying Rabbi Yosei is always right, which is basically true. And since Rabbi Yosei says we follow Rabbi Yehuda, that it's 3 separate gorings to become a muad, and we follow Rabbi Meir to become a tam again by not goring when children pet it, that must be the law. Rava said to Rav Nachman, well, why not let the master say the reverse, that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir concerning the criteria for deeming the animal forewarned, as Rabbi Shimon concedes to his opinion on this issue, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda concerning the criteria for reverting an ox back to becoming innocuous, as Rabbi Shimon concedes to his opinion on that issue. And Rav Nachman replied to Rava, I hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, as Rabbi Yosei's analysis is with him, i.e. it is sound. Right? So he's not saying that I follow Rabbi Yosei because I always follow Rabbi Yosei, saying I follow Rabbi Yosei because in this case, Rabbi Yosei's opinion makes sense. A dilemma was raised before the sages. The 3 days that the Mishnah teaches in the context of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion with regard to the testimony needed to assign the status of forewarned, muad, to an ox, are they needed in order to render the ox muad, or are they needed in order to forewarn the owner that he needs to take precautions to keep it from causing further harm? Well, the ox doesn't understand what label is being attached to it, so what are you really saying? So the Gemara asks, right, my benehu, what is the practical difference between the 2 possibilities? And the Gemara answers, the practical difference is in a case where 3 groups of witnesses came to the court on one day, each testifying about a separate instance of goring caused by the ox in the past on 3 separate days. Now, if you say that their testimony serves to render the ox muad by determining that it gored on 3 separate days, then in this case, the animal has been classified as a muad on the basis of their testimony. But if you say that their testimony serves to forewarn the man, the owner, well, the ox has not been classified as muad on the basis of these circumstances, since the owner heard all of the testimony on a single day. And this enables him to say, well, it is only now that they testified against me that I have learned that my ox is a muad. And therefore, his ox will not be deemed forewarned until he has been issued warnings over the course of 3 separate days. What then is the solution to the dilemma raised above, right? Since the witnesses are part of this, it's not just that the ox gored on 3 separate days, it's that witnesses testify. So, is it that the ox gored on 3 separate days and witnesses say so? Or is it that witnesses call out the owner and tell him, your ox gored? And that has to happen 3 separate times, and only then is the ox considered a muad. So the Gemara suggests, come in here, a solution from a Baraisa Tosefta 2:3. An ox does not become muad until witnesses testify against it in the presence of its owner and in the presence of a court. If they testified against it in the presence of a court, but not in the presence of its owner, or in the presence of its owner, but not in the presence of a court, it does not become muad until they testify against it in the presence of a court and in the presence of its owner. Furthermore, if 2 witnesses testified against the ox concerning its first incident of goring, and 2 other witnesses testified against it concerning the second incident, and 2 other witnesses testified against it concerning the third incident, there are 3 separate testimonies here, but they are considered as one with regard to rendering their statements as conspiring testimony, right? Like if 3 groups of 6 witnesses, 3 groups of witnesses got together and said, we're going to frame this guy and testify falsely against him, then even though they're testifying about 3 separate instances, all their testimony is deemed one testimony if it can be proven that any 2 of those witnesses weren't actually where they said they were, and therefore it's conspiring testimony. Therefore, if the first set of witnesses is determined to be conspiring witnesses, there are 2 testimonies remaining here that claim that the ox gored, and the owner must pay for half the cost of the damage in each case. Half the cost, not the full cost. Half the cost because the ox is just considered a tom, an innocuous ox. But the owner of the ox is exempt from having to pay the full cost of the damage because 2 of the witnesses were false, and so the ox was never rendered a muad. And the conspiring witnesses are exempt from paying the owner what he would have had to pay were their testimony accepted and his ox deemed forewarned. Why? Because they testified only concerning the first incident of goring, and the ox would not have been deemed forewarned on the basis of this testimony alone. And similarly, if the second set of witnesses were also determined to be conspiring witnesses, there is 1 testimony remaining here that claims that the ox gored the third. At this point, too, the owner of the ox is exempt from having to pay the full cost of the damage, and the conspiring witnesses are exempt from having to pay the owner the full cost of the damage. But the conspiring witnesses would have to pay the half damages in each instance that they were lying about. Of course, they're not off the hook for that. Now, if the third group of witnesses was also determined to be conspiring witnesses, then all the witnesses become liable to pay the full cost of the damages as if their testimony had been accepted and not disproven. So now they all have to pay the full cost of the damages. And concerning this, it is stated, and you shall do unto him as he had conspired to do unto his brother, right? The general law of conspiring witnesses. If, for example, in a murder case, 2 witnesses come and say, we saw that man kill that other man, and it turns out that they're liars, and we bring witnesses that show that those 2 witnesses couldn't have seen that because, in fact, they were somewhere else, then they're deemed conspiring witnesses, and the punishment for them is what the defendant would have received as punishment had they not lied about him. Big incentive not to become conspiring witnesses. The Gemara clarifies, if you say that the purpose of the testimony is to render the ox forewarned, right? In other words, if we're rendering the ox forewarned or whether we're warning the owner, if it's the former, then that means that 3 sets of witnesses who saw incidents on 3 separate days could all come to court at the same time, testify, and then that ox becomes a muad, even though the owner didn't know about it before. So if you say that the purpose of the testimony is to render the ox forewarned, the law presented in this baraisa works out well. As, according to this opinion, it can be said that all the witnesses came on the same day at the behest of the alleged victim of the 3rd incident, and therefore they were all certainly aware of each other's testimony. Consequently, the first set of witnesses shares in the responsibility for the testimony of the last group, as they are all co-witnesses in the effort to have the ox rendered forewarned. Now we're on 24b. But if you say that the witnesses came to forewarn the man, the owner of the ox, to caution him to safeguard his animal from causing harm, well, then they must have come on 3 separate days. And if so, let these first witnesses say, did we know that after 3 days these other witnesses were going to come and testify about the animal? Therefore, it must be that the case in the baraisa is one where the 3 groups of witnesses all came on the same day. And if that is so, the purpose of the testimony must be to render the ox forewarned rather than the man. So Rav Ashi said, I recited this law, this halacha, before Rav Kahana, and he replied to me in response to this proof, and does it work out well to say that they are coming to render the ox forewarned, even in a case where all of the witnesses arrive in court on the same day? Let these last witnesses say, from where were we to know that all those standing in court came to testify about the ox? We came to make this person liable to pay for half the cost of the damage that his animal allegedly caused, but we are not responsible for the attempt to make him pay the full cost of the damage for the 3rd incident. We had nothing to do with that. And the Gemara answers, it must be that the case concerns a situation where the different groups of witnesses were observed signaling to each other. Big conspiracy. And therefore it is clear that they were aware of each other's testimony and that they came to the court for this purpose. Rav Ashi said the case is one where they all came in succession, one following the other, and therefore it is clear that the latter witnesses were aware of the former. Ravina said, in this case, the witnesses said that they were acquainted with the owner of the goring ox, but they were not familiar with the ox itself. This indicates that they were coming to court to render the ox forewarned, as the witnesses are not able to identify the goring ox, and they would not be able to hold its owner liable to pay for even half the cost of the damage, as this payment is paid only from the proceeds of the sale of the animal. Therefore, the only purpose of their testimony would be to hold the owner liable to pay the full cost of the damage for the 3rd incident, as this payment is made from the owner's superior quality land. And the Gemara asks, but if they were not familiar with the ox itself, how could they render it forewarned? And the Gemara answers, they said to the animal's owner, you have a goring ox among your cattle, and therefore you need to safeguard all of your cattle. A dilemma was raised before the sages in the case of one who incites. Now we're moving on to a new subject. So did we really resolve what's being forewarned? The owner, you have a goring ox, and there's 3 witness testimonies about that, or the ox itself, right? And as soon as we have 3 testimonies of that, even if they have separate occasions, but all testifying the same day, the ox is deemed forewarned, and the 4th instance, he pays full damages. Seems like we didn't really settle the question. But it is true that testimony leading to an animal being deemed forewarned can be given only in the presence of the owner and in the presence of the court. But could all 3 testimonies about 3 separate days happen on the same day? Unclear. We're moving on. So a dilemma was raised before the sages in the case of one who incites another's dog against another, i.e. a 3rd person, and he is injured. Then what is the law? Okay, so Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven owns a mean dog. Reuven ties up his dog and he's not present. Or he is present, but he didn't do anything. He's walking his dog and he's not bothering anybody. Shimon knows that Reuven's dog is a nasty dog when incited. Shimon hates Levi. So as Reuven comes up the street walking his dog, Shimon screams at the dog, "Sick him!" pointing to Levi, and the dog harms Levi. So Reuven owns the dog, Shimon did the inciting, Levi got hurt by the dog. What result? The one who incited the animal against him is certainly exempt. Shimon is exempt. He's the one that caused the problem. Since he did not cause the damage directly, he didn't bite Levi. He just, incited Reuven's dog to do it. And neither did his property, because he doesn't own the dog. It's Reuven's dog. So what is the law with regard to the owner, to Reuven? And the Gemara explains the different sides of the question. Do we say that the owner of the dog can say to the injured party, Reuven can say to Levi, "What did I do to the dog?" Or perhaps we say to him, since you are aware that if others incite your dog, it is prone to being affected by the incitement and attacking people, you ought not to have kept it in your possession. Since you didn't get rid of the dog, you are liable for the damage and the injuries that it causes. Is that what we say? Rabbi Zera said, come in here, a solution from the Baraisa. An ox reverts to its former innocuous status if children pet it, and nevertheless it does not gore. It can be inferred from this that if it gores when the children pet it, the owner would be liable to pay for the damage. An ox that gores because children pet it can be likened to one that gores because it was incited to do so. And nevertheless, the Mishna holds the owner liable. Abaye said, is it taught in the Baraisa that if it gored, the owner is liable? Perhaps that is not what the Baraisa means. It merely means that if it gored, it does not revert to innocuous status. But the owner is not liable for any of the damage caused by that goring because the children incited the animal to do so, and therefore nothing can be conclusively demonstrated from that Baraisa. So the Gemara attempts to prove this point from a different source. Come in here, a solution from a Mishnah in Tractate Sanhedrin 76b. If one incited a dog against another person or incited a snake against another person, he is exempt. And what? Is it not that the one who incited the dog against him is exempt, but the owner of the dog is liable? And the Gemara rejects this. No! Say that even the one who incited the animal against him is exempt as well as the owner. And Rava said, well, even if you say that the one who incites the dog of another against yet a third person is liable, nevertheless, if he incited the dog against himself, i.e. the dog bit the one who was inciting it to attack, he is exempt. And what is the reason for this? Due to the principle that with regard to anyone who deviates from normative behavior in his actions, if another came along afterward and deviates from the norm with regard to the action the first has done, and thereby causes damage to him, the one who causes the damage is exempt from liability. Since this individual deviated from normal behavior and incited the dog against himself, the owner of the dog is not responsible for any damage the dog causes to him as a result. Although, generally speaking, anytime a dog bites, it is in and of itself a deviation from its typical behavior and something for which its owner would normally be held liable, right? So normally the owner is liable if his dog bites somebody else. But if his dog bites somebody who was inciting the dog, teasing the dog, getting in the dog's face, and then got bit for it, then the owner is exempt. So Rav Papa said to Rava, it was said in the name of Reish Lakish, So Rav Papa said to Rava, it was stated in the name of Reish. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. It was stated in the name of Reish Lakish in accordance with... So Rav Papa says to Rava, it was stated in the name of Reish Lakish in accordance with your opinion, that if anyone deviates from normal behavior in his actions, and then another one comes along afterward and deviates from the norm with regard to the action that the first has done and thereby causes damage to him, the one who causes the damage is exempt from liability. As Reish Lakish says, if there were two cows in the public domain, one lying prone in the street and the other one walking, if the walking cow kicked the cow that's lying down in the street, its owner is exempt from liability. Why? Because kicking is like goring, so normally the walking cow that kicked would be liable. Its owner would be liable. But a cow lying down in the middle of the street, that's abnormal. And because it's abnormal, the kicking follows in the first abnormal behavior, and that's why the owner is off the hook, even though if his walking cow had kicked a standing cow, he, yes, would have been liable. But if the cow that's lying in the street kicked the walking cow, then the owner of the lying down cow is liable. Doesn't matter that his cow was lying down. The cow that was injured is the one that was walking down the street. It was behaving normally. The fact that it was the lying down cow, thrashed out its leg and kicked the walking cow, it's irrelevant that it was lying down. The fact is, the owner of a cow, his cow kicked another cow in the street that was conducting itself in a normal manner. That's why the owner of the prone cow is liable. So the rationale for this is that since it is typical behavior for cows to walk in the public domain, and the prone cow deviated from this behavior, even if the walking cow also acted atypically and kicked the prone cow, the owner is exempt from liability. So Rava said back to Rav Papa, that is not in accordance with my opinion, as I would have held the owner of the walking cow liable in that case, because in my opinion, we say to him on behalf of the prone cow, it is true that you have the right to tread on me in the public domain, because I'm lying down, which is abnormal, but you do not have the right to kick me. And therefore, Rava's and Reish Lakish's opinions are not exactly the same. And that's where we're going to leave it and continue tomorrow, God willing, with Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 2. Okay, just a couple of questions on Bava, Kamma 24. Sharon, wouldn't an injured party who was the one gored demonstrate their injuries as proof that the goring actually happened at all? You're saying with respect to the idea that the witnesses who come to testify might be conspiring witnesses, might be liars. And so if they have the wounds, then who's going to say they're wrong? I would agree with you. But, it might happen that the testimony happens in a court of law a year later, right? So, a lot of time has passed, the wound might have healed, and that might not be dispositive for the situation. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. Joseph, are there any sort of laws that prevent frivolous lawsuits that attempt to blame others on technicalities? Would that fall under false testimony? I mean, absolutely, right? If you are deemed to be lying in court, and that's proven by other witnesses, right? So then you have the penalties of the conspiring witnesses, and that's a big penalty. So I think that would answer your question. If it's the defendant is making, the plaintiff is making the claim falsely, well, he has to prove it, right? So it's not, his say-so is not enough. When he brings witness, so if he is lying, and then he brings witnesses to prove the lie that he's telling, well, it must be that the witnesses are lying also. So that's why now the witnesses are punished. So I guess a good question would be, well, if the witnesses are punished, what about the plaintiff who originally started this conspiracy? How is he punished? And I don't have the answer offhand, but please God, that guy should be punished, at least like the witnesses that he hired, if not more. I think he is. I just don't remember what the rationale is for that. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we're together again tomorrow night at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific.